Hi, and welcome to week 7 of IDSB10. And this week we're talking about mobile technologies and rural economic development. Not many of you have contributed to the C2C discussion for this week, and we really hope that after this presentation you'll go online and type in some of your own ideas. I'm sure you all use cell phones every day. You might have used cell phones while traveling. You might have seen interesting examples of using it, and hopefully you'll have some ideas from the readings, from the videos, and from some of your own research. So I hope to hear from you. In this presentation, I will talk a little bit about one of the papers which introduced a number of studies, and we'll use this week to go a little bit in depth when it comes to doing impact studies and how do people do research on the effect of development projects. And this is something that's relevant to very many topics in this course, and hopefully you'll come across it again in your studies if, for example, you do a project management course later. But it's something that fit really well with this week and the articles that we selected. So I'll go through that in some detail, and I'll provide a few case studies of SMSs, with cell phones being used for different purposes. I won't go too much in detail, but it's quite easy for you to find much more information about these, and we look forward to discuss these with you on C2C. So hopefully you've read the two articles for this week. First of all, there was a term that I listed on the outline, on the weekly outline, which isn't mentioned in any of the two readings, so I'm going to briefly explain it now. It's the idea of leapfrogging, and this concept, which some of you might have heard of, means that you have, let's say you have Canada or the US, where the government and companies have invested large amounts of money in different kinds of infrastructure. And a good example is the telephone infrastructure and the fixed line infrastructure, where every single building has a cable going into it that carries telephone signals. And even if you don't maybe subscribe to a fixed phone service anymore, every single house being built will have this kind of basic infrastructure. Now, it's very expensive to build out this kind of infrastructure in a country that doesn't have it. And in fact, in Russia, for example, in the Soviet Union, it was common to have to wait for years to be able to get fixed line phone service. And even going further back in the US, that was the same case. You had one monopoly company that served phones, and they took their time, and there was nothing much you could do about it. So having a phone was a kind of a privilege. And of course, if you try to build out that kind of a fixed line system in many developing world countries, that would take a huge amount of time. And before we had cell phones, typically only a few people per hundred or per thousand would have access to phones at all. Now, because cell phones do not rely on this individual lines into each single building, you can build a cell phone tower and immediately gain access to a large amount of buildings, especially in very densely populated areas. It's actually much cheaper to rapidly cover a lot of houses. And so instead of developing countries having to go through every single stage that we went through, and first ensuring 100% coverage of landlines before they begin building out cell phones, they can, so to say, leapfrog, and they can kind of skip the stage of landlines altogether, or mainly, and go straight to cell phones. In the same way, many people might have never used a desktop computer. Their first computer ever was a laptop, right? So the idea that especially this kind of very expensive infrastructure can actually can be skipped, and that this would help developing countries develop more rapidly, or catch up more rapidly to developed countries. And it's not really the technology in the cell phone itself, but it really talks about the required infrastructure that surrounds that cell phone, with the towers and the phone lines and everything. And you could look at other legacy structures. You could, for example, some people are saying that countries where there's very poor electricity connection to villages, perhaps those villages could set up um, micro generators such as solar cells or windmills that only supply the local area, and kind of leapfrog this necessity to have a national electricity grid. That's one idea, right? Others have talked about perhaps Brazil could go straight to Linux and not have Windows first. Now, that's a more difficult question, but there's a lot of writing from the economic perspective about this idea of leapfrogging, and I think cell phones is kind of the most obvious example of that. Wi-Fi for computers could be the same thing, that you don't wire buildings for internet cabling. You just insert some wireless network technology. Anyway, going on to discuss the article that was talking about different research paradigms. Um, if we think about doing research specifically about a program, a development program, or tendency, we have to look at what the purpose of this research is. And a lot of this research is being done by the organizations themselves, whether it's the organization that is actually carrying out a given project, or it's the funding organization. So, for example, the World Bank might do a lot of research, different United Nations organizations, um, different international NGOs like CARE International, and so on. Some of this research might be done by academics, people at universities or in think tanks, right? So they'll have different purposes, and accountability is obviously a big one. It's very common when organizations receive money that they need to prove that their projects have impact, that they are successful, that they are doing what they're supposed to do. Um, so there's a difference, and we'll come back to that, between this idea of accountability and this idea of improving organizational effectiveness. And if you transfer that to education, it's kind of like the difference between formative and summative assessment. So, formative assessment is what ideally goes on during the period of a course. When you get feedback on your essays, the idea is that that feedback will help you improve and that your next essays will get better. Whereas when you get feedback at the end of the term, in fact, at U of T, you don't even get your final papers back, which personally I think is wrong, but that's the way it works. And the idea is we're not really trying to help you do better in this course. This course is finished, but we're trying to assess how much you've learned, and what kind of skills and abilities you have. So similarly, accountability really looks at, was this project successful or not? Did it achieve what it was set out to achieve or not? Did it have an impact or not? And how large an impact? Whereas the second point here is looking at how can we better um, do what we're trying to do? How can we improve our abilities to help this community? How can this project be more effective? So those are related questions, but they are quite different, and they require probably different kinds of research designs. The third one is academic knowledge. So, uh, and this could be seen in many different ways, but basically the idea that this knowledge should be useful beyond the confines of this specific project, or many times sometimes beyond this specific area, field, country, and so on. It should so there and there are many people who also mix up and don't realize the difference between kind of academic or scientific research and what we call program evaluation. For example, when I was visiting China last summer and I met with a number of graduate students who were doing research on educational technology, I found many of them were doing program evaluation. So they had a program perhaps at their own university, and they wanted to see whether that program was effective or not, or how to improve it. Now, to make something academic knowledge, something more than that is needed. And typically, you need a level of abstraction. You need some way of saying that the data or the findings that you came up with, the conclusions that you came up with, have some validity in other settings. And typically, what you need for that is some kind of a theoretical framework. So if I'm going to a small village in Africa and I show that introducing cell phones has improved their use of information and has led them to be have better nutrition, let's say. In order for that to have any validity for others, I have to be able to identify under which conditions would something like that happen in another community, right? So if I did the same kind of intervention in another country, would it also, can I predict that it would have the same results? And that's a much kind of higher demand for abstraction, for theoretical frameworks, and so on. Now, once we've looked at the research purposes, going back to this idea of proving impact versus improving impact, which is similar to what I was just saying, the first and second point, right? Accountability means that you're proving that there was impact and perhaps how much impact. Whereas organizational effectiveness is looking at how can we improve this impact. Now, if you're trying to prove something, what you want to do is to go beyond correlation, right? So if we're talking about a quantitative study. Typically, you'll have some variables, and one variable could be number of cell phones per family. One variable could be a level of education. One variable could be level of nutrition or family income and so on. And the first thing you do statistically then is typically to establish that there's some correlation. So perhaps you find that people who own cell phones have a higher income than people who don't. Perhaps you show that people who received cell phones from your team are doing better in their sales than people who did not. So that's a correlation. But going from a correlation to a causal relationship, to say the fact that they received the cell phones is what caused their income to go up. That's actually a much more complicated question. And typically you need a large sample size, you need a lot of people to be able to have something that's reliable. And perhaps you need a control group. So you say, here's a group of people who were part of our project, here's these other people that were not part of the project. Well, how do you determine that those two groups are similar, right? That's very difficult. How do you determine that it's the cell phones that made them richer, not that they got the cell phones because they were already richer, right? Or perhaps they got them for some external reason that also led to them being richer. Now, when we're looking at improving impact, we want to understand not just what happened, but why did it happen? How did it happen? In order for us to be able to see, well, what are the obstacles? How can we make this work even better? So you'll often still use some statistics, some surveys, for example, but you'll usually also have some qualitative methods, which might mean focus groups, it might mean interviews, it might mean observation. Maybe you're following someone around for the whole day to see how they're living. It could be a number of different ways, but it's a much, and typically you'll be happy with a much smaller sample because you're not trying to prove something scientifically, but you're trying to get a very deep understanding of how someone relates to this technology and how this technology fits in with their entire life or with the community, for example, in that village. So when you design your research project, you might ask, what am I going to measure? And related to that, if you're talking about measuring impact, you might say, my question is this project successful or not? Well, what constitutes success for you? And this needs to be very clear from the very beginning what you think of as success and why you think of this as success, right? Is it better nutrition? Is it better household income? Is it better access to markets, right? And how do you measure these different things? Is it happiness? Well, how do you measure happiness? um, and then, of course, once you decide what to measure, you start thinking about how to get that data and how to make sure that that data is reliable. Unit of analysis. So are you looking at individual people? Are you looking at households? Are you looking at villages, right? Are you looking at cell phones? So there's 100 cell phones in that village, but maybe each cell phone is being used by 5, 6 people because people lend them to their friends and so on. So you have to consider that. And when we talk about inputs, typically it's what did the project put into this. So you could measure the number of trainings you did, the number of cell phones you supplied, the number of cell phone minutes, or whatever that you supplied into this project. And then you can look at activities, you can look at the outputs, and you can look at immediate change in behavior. So you can see, well, the people who were given access to cell phones in this project typically tended not to travel as much, and they typically made 2 phone calls per day. Um, so that's a very immediate outcome, but is that something successful? Did that really contribute to the ultimate goals of your project? That's often very much harder to assess. Um, and then a really tricky question, and this is especially important for development organizations. Um, so you could measure and you could say the group that had access to cell phones were more successful, they sold more in the marketplace, for example, they got higher incomes for their grain than groups that did not have access to cell phones. However, was this because the growth, so that if you talk about the pie as the income of the whole village or the whole country, did that pie get bigger or was there just a change in distribution? What that means is, did was there the same level of overall income to that village, and all the cell phones did is that suddenly some people were getting more and some people were getting less? Or did it actually cause higher productivity, which still meant that some people got more, but it didn't necessarily mean that the other people got less, they just kept getting what they were getting before? This you could think about in relation to education as well. If you go back to think about the week we talked about credentialism and human capital theory. Obviously, when governments invest a large amount of money and when the World Bank and the UN decides to lend money to countries to invest in their education system, they believe that the pie is growing, right? So the entire GDP of the whole country will grow. There will be more tax income in the future, and of course, some people will make more than others, but it's a net growth. What others have maybe criticized this idea and said that if in a situation that's characterized as credentialism, there's the same amount of jobs, people have the same amount of productivity. It's just that those people with higher education get those jobs, and they're not better at doing them than others. They just get them. In that case, and in the case that I just mentioned with this village, it still makes sense for individuals to seek out this advantage, but it doesn't make sense for society as a whole to support this kind of trend. So we're not going to give you an exam asking you to come up with a complete research design, taking all this into account. And I'm sure you'll go over this again in future courses. But I'm going over it now, especially because it was very well explained in that article, to get you to start thinking about these kind of issues. And especially as you go on and you'll read a number of articles in this course and in other courses talking about different kinds of projects, evaluations, and research. um, for you to be able to think critically about the research design and the findings that they present, and also to think about the challenges that are inherent in trying to measure success of different projects. For example, the microcredit projects in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank, which have been very widely written about as a success story in the development literature, although there are people who criticize it and say it's not actually creating wealth in the village. It's simply shifting some of the business to these people who are lucky getting microcredit loans, and other people lose their business. So in aggregate, the village is just as poor as it used to be, and it's not never going to bring all of Bangladesh out of poverty. So just for you to keep that in mind as a possibility. Typically, there's two different ways of doing research, because usually you want to be able to compare some data points. If I just tell you right now 40% of the population in the country has cell phones, that in itself is not very interesting. So one possibility is doing a longitudinal study, which is to say 5 years ago this many percentage had them, and now this many percentage. So you could look at the change in that percentage, and then you could look at which other factors changed at the same time, and what is the relationship between these factors. Now, doing that can be very expensive because it takes a lot of time. Of course, the UN publishes annual statistics about some of these things, and you could just go and look in their database. But typically, if you want to know, if you want data from a specific community, you have to go in there and get that data yourself, and you might have to wait 5 years or 10 years to be able to conclude your study, and it's very hard to get funding for that kind of research. It's also difficult to know, again, to establish these causal factors. I mean, you could look at a country and say 10 years ago there were almost no cell phones. Today there are lots of cell phones, and at the same time, GDP went up by 10%. Can you really say that the introduction of cell phones led to GDP going up? I mean, all kinds of other things changed in those 10 years as well. So how are you able to isolate? And one way could be to combine this with a control group, and so you say, well, here's two places in this country. One place had a lot of cell phones, another place didn't over these 10 years, but everything else was the same, and there's a change in factors. So there are ways of getting around it, but it's quite challenging. You could also just say right now in this village there are 40% of people have cell phones, and this is their market participation rate, and in this other village there's another situation. So you could compare at the same time but across different groups. Now, when we talk about independent variables, basically, if we assume that there's a causal factor, we assume that something has caused something else. We call the variables that are causing something to happen independent variables, and we call the variables that we think have been changed for dependent variables. So, for example, if you believe that people who exercise more become more fit, then you could say number of hours per week of running is the independent variable, and let's say speed at the time to complete the marathon is the dependent variable. So you believe that there's a relationship between those. And what this article criticizes is that many of the studies of cell phones talk about cell phones as independent variables. What that means is that they're not really dependent on anything else. Yet, as I was mentioning earlier, what if only certain groups have cell phones? And what if the factor that led them to have cell phones also has an influence on the factor that you're trying to measure? And typical example could be that people with cell phones are wealthier, they might have more education, they might be more urban, and thus any of your conclusions from trying to say that cell phone ownership caused certain things will be problematic. Of course, one way of getting around this would be to take a truly random group and then give them cell phones. And so you kind of causing this random sampling, and you say, no, I made sure that it's completely random who got the cell phones, and now we'll see what happens, right? And that's actually the difference between an intervention study and an observational study. So an intervention study means that you go in there and you change one of these variables. For example, by giving people cell phones, by training them, by doing something to their lives which you want to measure. So the thing that you're doing is typically the independent variable. And of course, when you do it, you try to make sure that the people you do it to are a representative sample. Observational studies mean that you look at something that's already happening. So you go and you look at the people who have HIV and you try to see, obviously you're not going to go to a country and give people HIV, but you look at the people already with HIV, and then you could look at how that affects their health situation compared to people without HIV, for example. So, we obviously we could go on and on about research design, and here are some of the other factors: what kind of data is collected, how is it collected, how do you select the respondents, and this is what I was just touching upon. How do you make sure that the people you sample are representative for the group that you want to know something about? How do you triangulate? So can you actually look at can use different methods and try to get the same answer? Then that answer might be more credible. Do you do cross-sectional or longitudinal? Cross-sectional means that you look at different groups but at the same time. And what kind of theories or frameworks are supporting your research? So I'm going to leave it there. It would be really useful for you to take a good look at that article, and we'd be very happy to answer any questions or to discuss these ideas further. Now, to briefly kind of mention a few very famous examples of the use of cell phones in development. The Grameen Phone was an initiative in Bangladesh, actually between the Norwegian phone company and Grameen, which is a very large Bangladeshi development organization. They also have a huge school, informal school system. They do microcredit, as you might know about, and others. So they wanted to provide access to phones to rural villagers in Bangladesh. And they also wanted to use this as a way of getting people out of poverty and empowering women. So they came out with this idea of using microcredit to let women, only women, take up small loans of a few $100s to buy a cell phone and some airtime. It's usually pay as you go in many of these countries. And what they would do is they would set up a little kiosk where people could come and pay to use the phone. So it's kind of a human-powered phone kiosk, if you want to call it like that. And the advantage was that they could scale up very rapidly. They could start providing cell phone services in hundreds of thousands of villages, and you would have this human component. You have this person who would slowly every month be making money off this service, would be able to pay off her micro loan, invest in a bigger shop, and so on. And this has been quite successful, both in providing access to phones for people who did not have it before, and for increasing income for these phone women. However, right now this program is in rapid decline because phones have become so cheap. I mean, when this started about 10 years ago, you would have to pay a few $100s for a phone, and now you could get very cheap Nokia phones down to $20, $30, and so it's much more widespread for people to have their own phones, and these phone ladies are not making very much money anymore. But in a way, that's a success, because it's made, the program has made itself obsolete. So talking about e-governance, you could look at that from different points of view. You can look at it as the government providing various services to its citizens, but you could also look at it as e-civil society. So how can cell phones help NGOs organize? How can they help people do reporting of corruption, and so on? And this is Ushahidi is an open source tool which you can look up online, which combines, I think they use Google Maps with this cell phone interface. So, for example, and they call it crisis mapping technology. So, in many crisis situations, whether it's a civil war, or a flood, or other kinds of emergencies, you have this tool that can receive information from hundreds of thousands of people who are sending text messages, sending pictures, and so on, that are geotagged typically. So you know where the picture was taken. People might send in messages telling people that this road is blocked, it's dangerous to travel here, we need certain things, this person was just found. And the system can map this so that you can rapidly get an overview of what's happening where in the whole country. And doing this before that, so this is a way of crowdsourcing, right? So you have, instead of having a small team of professionals who are flying around in a helicopter and trying to find out what's going on, you enable the broad masses to collaborate in such a chaotic situation, to establish what's going on and to document it. And it's been used in a number of different countries to great success. It's a very powerful kind of technology that's been made available. And there are a number of similar projects. And these projects and many, many other projects typically rely on SMS, which is text messaging. And it's funny because text messaging, in fact, was never designed as a feature of cell phones. It was actually built into cell phones initially, I think, for providers to be able to send users brief messages, like maybe the fact that you had to pay more for your subscription or stuff like that. And they never really thought that people would want to send each other text messages, because after all, we can call each other, right? But they had this opportunity in the system, and once they enabled users to use it, it rapidly took off, especially because it tended to be a lot cheaper in many places to use than to call. Because many users are on pay-as-you-go plans, and it's in fact, outside North America, it's quite uncommon to have these kind of call as much as you want plans. So you pay for every minute. But the other really huge advantage of SMS is that it's you can process it automatically by computer. And initially, you needed to be hooked into the phone company. You needed maybe very expensive computers and software to be able to deliver services. But gradually, as we had the emergence of smartphones, for example, and some open source software, it became possible for anyone to run a automated SMS service very cheaply. So what I mean by that is you could have a phone number, someone could text a message, and they could get an automated reply back. And you could obviously come up with all kinds of different applications for that. And so SMS has been incredibly influential in the mobile development field, because you can develop all these great applications. So you could have health workers who are reporting in the statistics for child weight, for example, when they're doing infant checks. You could have people requesting information and automatically getting information from a database, getting prices of grain or weather information, all kinds of different services, and uh, there's more than I could list here. Now, an interesting question, of course, will be how rapidly smartphones spread in developing countries, and how that will impact these kind of services. Because traditionally, most of the mobile development projects have been looking at very, very cheap phones that simply are able to call and to send text messages. And of course, now it's becoming more and more common with smartphones that can take pictures, that can run simple applications, and even you could say almost small computers like iPhones or Android phones that can actually run very advanced applications. And there have been some experiments with using smartphones, um, but I think that's an area that is still playing out, and it'll be really interesting to see how that ends up. So I'm not going to talk too much more this week, but one of the questions that I asked this week, and which I think it's really worth thinking about, is the economic aspect of this, and the role of NGOs, the role of international development organizations. Because to some extent, you could say that the cell phone revolution, which I don't think anyone doubts has really had a huge impact on the developing world, whether you look at it from an economic perspective or you look at it from a perspective of increasing people's freedom or potential. You know, it's to a certain extent a large victory for the private sector. I mean, typically in many of these countries, there used to be a monopoly, a government monopoly that ran the landlines, and it was only as this monopoly was chipped away slowly by private cell phone companies, and there was massive, typically, investment in this field, and you got, of course, also massive investment, private investment in the cell phone producers that enabled them to gradually produce cheaper and cheaper phones. That this thing happened, and although there are lots of interesting cases where development organizations have a kind of used the existence of cell phones in a productive way. So, for example, setting up these kind of SMS services, the actual cell phone infrastructure itself and the ownership of cell phones, in most cases, has not been very much influenced by either NGOs or even national governments. So the phone ladies from Grameen Bank was perhaps an exception there. So it's an interesting example of something that happens largely through private investment and, of course, private consumer spending, but then which, once it has established itself, becomes this new infrastructure upon which you can develop all these kind of services that perhaps would not exist otherwise. So I'm going to end there for this week. And I hope that, again, you go to C2C, you comment, or you ask any questions. You can ask other questions or answer other questions than the ones that I posted. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great weekend.